Good afternoon, everybody. This is 21st century, right? Recording is always in progress. Good afternoon, everybody. I appreciate the folks that were able to show up in person, and I appreciate everybody who's tuning in. Today is our last Distinguished Speaker Series speaker, and we've had quite a good year, I think, an exciting year, thanks to Dave Tyndall, who organized all the speakers for this year. Today we are really lucky to have Dr. McLaughlin. I've gotten to know his work more as I came to UBC, but and really enjoyed engaging with him both on Twitter and in my own thinking as I read his work. He's a professor of sociology at McMaster University. His work focuses primarily on the sociology of intellectuals, knowledge, and ideas. From my perspective, he's somewhat of a classic theorist, and I guess we're all kind of dinosaurs, those of us who claim that. He's an author of over 30 peer-reviewed articles, several edited volumes, and he has 2 monographs that are forthcoming. The first, Erich Fromm, Sociology, which will be some of what he's just talking about today, and the second one is Canadian Sociology of the First Person. His work primarily draws on interesting critical theory, especially those stemming from German public intellectual and Frankfurt School member Erich Fromm, who is, I don't know what he's going to say today, but I would say he's a somewhat long-lost social theorist in relationship to people like Adorno and Horkheimer, who somehow survived. Along with these interesting critical sociologies, he's driven to explore the impact of psychoanalysis in sociology, along with many psychological ideas from folks like Maslow. And he's also engaged with various academic thinkers. For instance, he's writing on women public intellectuals in Canada with Ida Mergler. This work is just one component of the much larger focus on public intellectuals, public sociology, both in Canada and around the world. Today, he's going to be talking, as I said, about Erich Fromm, and he's really focused on the canonization process in sociology, and he uses Fromm as a way to sort of complicate this or to critique it, and to think a little bit harder about what canonization means. And with that, I'm going to record.
Hey, it's really great to be here. And, so I want to talk about this book, Erich Fromm and Global Public Sociology, Bristol University Press. It's just and obviously thoughts from that book. And I'll give you an outline of what I want to talk about. I want to give you a little bit of background on the story of the book and kind of the context, how it came to write the book and what it's about. And then I want to zoom in on 2 aspects of the book. One is the question of canonization, why Fromm belongs in the public sociology canon. And then thirdly, maybe trying to move it towards a contemporary discussion about what in Fromm's ideas are useful today, but perhaps more centrally for today. What lessons can we learn about public sociology, about doing public sociology today from the case of Fromm? So that's the outline. So my path to the book, Erich Fromm. So I grew up in Montreal, and I got a soccer scholarship to Cleveland State University. That's why I went to university. I played professional soccer. While I was there, they made me take classes. But one of the things that I read was a book by Erich Fromm called The State Proofreader, which was published in 1941. And it was a brilliant psychoanalytic, Marxist, sociological analysis of the rise of the Nazi movement. And this book was a classic, an instant classic, bestseller. It was cited in all the major sociology journals, and it's having a revival today. Well, I don't know why, because of world events bringing back this book. But I was particularly interested, not so much in the psychoanalytic Fromm or even the sociological Fromm. At that time, I had no interest in being a professor. I thought being a professor was somewhere, just above a serial killer on the moral scale, because I was sort of a political activist. I wanted to move America to the left, and I moved to New York City with precisely that goal of moving America to the left. Obviously, I didn't do a very good job, but I spent a decade in Democratic Socialists of America, and I was interested primarily in the socialist Fromm. That's sort of what I was interested in. And who was Fromm? Well, he was born in 1900 and died in 1980. He actually did a PhD in sociology with Alfred Weber, Max Weber's younger brother. He was trained as a psychoanalyst, and he pioneered revisions in Freudian theory and spent his life also as a therapist. And he was part of this critical theory, which is essentially was a German Marxist think tank that was funded by a German grain merchant who made a fortune on tea and he gave his money to his son as an early inheritance, and he founded this sort of network of kind of neo-Marxist, a fixed Marxist theory. And he also wrote books, popular books that sold this is an estimate from 10 years ago, but over 70 million copies, scores of books. So he was a public intellectual before we had that term. So after in my PhD program in New York, they also made me take classes while I was doing organizing, but I had to figure out what am I going to do for a topic. And I decided on building a set of dissertation, really, and then became a set of articles and ended up in this book over time, based on an observation. What I noticed was that, I say here dozens, but scores of socialists, American socialists, and world socialists, and scores of sociologists, some very major sociologists, were inspired by Fromm. They read him as an undergrad, they read him in grad school. It led me to socialism, and it also led me to sociology, but that was true for many people. But what I noticed is the further I went up sociology profession, or the political organizing within the American socialist movement, the further I went to the core, where the elites within the profession or within the movement, the more dismissive people were from. It's really quite striking. So I had this, I turned that into a sociological issue. So Fromm was a case of someone who was a major psychoanalytic theorist, a follower of Freud and a critic of Freud, that was widely read among psychoanalysts in the 50s. He was in all the personality textbooks. Abraham Maslow, the hierarchy of needs, in his memoirs, he says, I was a Frommian in my youth. From Fromm later, but Maslow was shaped by Fromm. He was a major part of this critical theory. We think of Adorno and Marx, but Fromm was more central to that group than Adorno was early on, and certainly more central than Marcuse. He got thrown out of that group for a story I'll tell a little bit here. He was very involved in criticizing American foreign policy during the Cold War. He was the mentor to David Riesman, the most important public sociologist from Harvard University. Fromm was his therapist, and he shaped Riesman's work. And he was a major public intellectual force opposing the American empire, opposing the nuclear arms race, the Vietnam War and later. And so he did all this stuff, and in the 40s and 50s and early 60s, by the 70s, he really disappeared from people's consciousness. And so I wanted to make this sociological, so I actually even have, I'm probably not your number one positivist, maybe I'm a recovering positivist in some sense, because part of what I wanted to do is I wanted to make an argument that my attempt to look at Fromm's decline had some empirical evidence for it, because everybody has their favorite theorist that they think is not cited enough, or it's not valued enough. So I wanted to document this, that there was actually something real. So I went through the American Sociological Review, AJS, Social Forces. I went through a bunch of different disciplines and journals in different countries, but this is from the American journals. And I took some of the people, Lipset, Merton, C. Wright Mills. It's interesting, people say C. Wright Mills was being neglected, but actually he's never as big as Merton, but he's pretty steady, actually. He doesn't really decline. Most people decline. They sort of they rise and they decline. That's Margaret Mead in anthropology, so gender is another issue. Talking about public intellectuals and what it means to be a public intellectual. Then I went through other people, and on this list, Fromm is the only one. In 1990, he just totally goes away from the sociology. Here's Adorno, who sort of is still, and some people are quite obsessed. We were engaging a little bit on Twitter. I mean, some people are a little bit obsessed with Adorno, I think. And so Fromm was uniquely disappeared. And why is that? Why did he become a forgotten intellectual? Well, I would say he was a Marxist who was a critic of orthodox Marxism, Freudian, who was critical of orthodox Freudian theories. He kind of broke the mold of the academic genre, so he wrote these popular, best-selling books that were really kind of like, they were aimed at a mid-brow audience. They were not at the New York Times. He was influential in those networks, but he went out of those networks write through this kind of middle ground, which academics, of course, and lead intellectuals kind of distance themselves from that. We don't want to be too popular. And he also challenged sociological orthodoxy. So he was arguing that sociology needed a psychological theory. Seth will respond to this as a different psychological theory, but he made that claim. And so one could say, well, was he even a sociologist? Well, Alfred Weber, supervisor, he did a working class in Weimar study, starting in 1929. We did an empirical survey of the middle class in Germany, trying to figure out why people were voting for Hitler. Paul Lazarsfeld, the great statistical sociologist, was Fromm's research assistant on that project before Lazarsfeld was even famous. Robert Lynn, when the Frankfurt School, Adorno and Horkheimer came to Columbia University, the reason why they came to Columbia University was Robert Lynn wrote Knowledge for What, the early part of public sociology and critical sociology. He wanted Fromm because of this empirical study that Fromm published in the, if you're looking for tenure, he did publish in the American Sociological Review once, and then there was an exchange in the American Journal of Sociology about his work. So he had some sociological credentials, although he didn't define himself primarily in that way. So the book, I tell the story of Fromm's public sociology. I'm going to focus in for the talk on 2 and 4. I explain his disappearance from public sociology. I try and evaluate and reformulate his sociological ideas for today. I don't think we just sort of look at Adorno and apply Adorno today. I think we have to reformulate all these ideas. I'm trying to do that a little bit here. And then I want to end on treating Fromm as this is probably something we could talk about, hopefully, as we discuss it. Treating Fromm as a case study to apply to today to encourage empirical research on public sociology, so we can talk about what does it mean to be a public sociologist. For Fromm, it was in the age of the paperback. Today, it's the age of the internet, so it's different. But that's what I'm doing. So is there a public sociology canon, and does Fromm belong in it? Well, if you'll remember, Michael Burroway, president of the American Sociological Association in 2004, and in ASR, there's the speech for public sociology in 2005. He argues you have professional sociology, writing for your colleagues on empirical and theoretical issues, policy sociology, trying to solve a problem for a client or outside body, the internal critical sociology, like Dorothy Smith, Du Bois, criticizing sociology in normative terms, and then the public sociology doing a dialogue. So this created a massive debate, and people are really talking about is sociology's scientific status going to be challenged by this public sociology? Is public sociology just a way to smuggle in politics or Marxism? So there's a debate about this. Other people have been arguing that the canon that he presents, Burroway talks about certain people as your classic public sociologist. Can we expand on that? We debate about that. And there's a whole debate about global public sociology and how does this public sociology look like in a world scale, and what does it look like, say, in Canada? What is a Canadian public sociology? And I know there's lots of people in this department, Tyndall and Reed Wolf and others have been doing public sociology in a Canadian context, so we would hopefully talk about some of that. So when we talk about the public sociology, maybe it's a canon, or maybe it's exemplars in Kuhnian sense, or maybe it's heroes. Who are the heroes of public sociology? It seems to me David Riesman and C. Wright Mills are probably the 2 major people that Burroway talks about. And so the interesting thing about Fromm is Fromm had a direct relationship to the work of both of these thinkers. So David Riesman, he was very much part of this liberal public sociology, Burroway calls it traditional public sociology, writing for the New York Times, writing for elite outlets. But Riesman was mentored by Fromm. As I mentioned, Fromm was his psychoanalyst, but then he became a friend, and they did a lot of political work together. They worked on anti-nuclear campaigns and things. The organization SANE, which is a very important nuclear organization was named after one of Fromm's books called The Sacred Society. So Fromm did this with reason, and the Lonely Crowd talks about what he calls an other-directed personality. It comes directly out of Fromm's book, Man for Himself, where he talks about the marketing character. It's a very, very direct link. So here is the most important of the liberal public sociologists, comes directly from very close relationship, and Fromm is really not mentioned at all in the public sociology debates. But it's also true that C. Wright Mills was very much influenced by Fromm early on. Fromm was, say, a decade earlier than Mills. They're quite different, but they actually shared a lot. Fromm influenced Mills. Mills went in his own direction. But if you put these two scholars together, I would say you have the two most important intellectuals in America in the 20th century that created theories of alienation in sociology, that created a Marxist sociology, and both of them were very much influential on the new left and the student movements. And what's happening now is you have an expansion of the canon, and rightly so, and W.E.B. Du Bois and Alden Morris's really important work about a scholar who's denied and now is being revived in challenging the racism that excluded Du Bois from the canon. And Jane Addams, who's a very important philanthropist and activist, social worker, and sociologist. So there's a kind of there's a revival of hidden or forgotten or excluded intellectuals in that canon. And I want to make the case here why Fromm should be added to that set of heroes, canons, examples. And I'll just make the case here. So no sociologist, no public sociologist in the 20th century has sold more books, had more influence than Erich Fromm. Not even close. He had massive influence in mass publics. He had a truly global, which David Reisman's a thinker when I did my dissertation. I interviewed him. C. Wright Mills, of course, has some global reach, but if you look at Google Scholar mentions of Fromm today, usually when they come out, more than half of them are not in English. Fromm had a massive influence in Latin America and massive influence in Eastern Central Europe. He had massive influence around the world outside in the German language. And so that is not so true with the other public sociologists. In public sociology, there is an attempt to make it more global, de-provincialize sociology in Burrowing's own terms. To be fair, Burrowing spent all the time work on that. But Fromm is an obvious example of trying to do that. I would also say that even though Fromm was unambiguously a person of the left, he had a very good relationship with David Reisman, who was a liberal elite. And Fromm was willing to engage with and dialogue with conservatives, much more so than conservatives who were willing to dialogue with him, by the way. So Robert Nisbet is a very similar, very important American theorist and conservative sociologist who was a major critic of Fromm. But Fromm actually was willing to dialogue with conservatives. I would argue, maybe a little bit controversially, I would argue if we're going to go public, we have to include conservative intellectuals. We have to have a dialogue outside our own political camps. Otherwise, I think we're not going to be as interesting, we're not going to have the same audiences, and I think we're going to miss some issues. Another issue why I would argue that Fromm was very important is, and there's been some discussions about Du Bois around this, and Du Bois, of course, is a much greater sociologist than Fromm. Fromm is doing too many things. He's a writer, he's a psychoanalyst. So Du Bois was a greater sociologist, unquestionably so. Du Bois was also a better activist. Is absolutely pioneering work in creating the Black liberation struggle, the Black, not single-handedly, but he played a major role. But there's a dark side to all heroes, and this is, and in his later life, Du Bois wrote an obituary to Stalin, a glowing obituary to Joseph Stalin. So there was a kind of political authoritarianism that was in Du Bois's work that we need to confront and engage, not to dismiss his contributions, but to get a full Fromm was deeply and unambiguously anti-capitalist and radical, and he was also deeply, unambiguously anti-Stalinist, anti-Bolshevik. In the end, he was a big fan of Rosa Luxemburg and Trotsky when he was young, but by the time Stalin controls the Soviet Union and the Chinese Communist Party, although we didn't see the version that we're living with today, was absolutely critical. And I think that's a very important part of public sociology. He was an incredibly clear and engaging writer, and I think his most important theoretical contribution is he had a unique theorizing of emotions. That if we want to have a sociology of emotions, Arlie Hochschild, much greater sociologist, much better empirical researcher, Fromm has a theory about emotions that is worth relooking at. So just to end then, I'll sort of like talk about some, maybe a little bit of sociological ideas. I try in the book, I try and really reformulate Fromm's ideas and bring them into today. So I'd say a few things about that. But primarily I'd like to focus on making the case that what we need is a research agenda on public sociology. It's not a matter of just doing public sociology. We have to sort of understand it in analytic terms. We really want to be reflexive about what public sociology is. So that's how I'll end. We can have a conversation about that. So there is, I would say, a little bit of a revival of interest in Erich Fromm's work. And part of that has to do with Erich Fromm was arguing that in Escape from Freedom, he says that Nazism is not a psychological phenomenon. It's a sociological, historical, political, economic phenomenon. We have to understand it in political, sociological, structural ways. We can't just psychologize Hitler. That's crazy. Individually just gain control of Germany. There's reasons why he gained control of Germany that have to be understood sociologically. But Hitler's personality is not irrelevant. Hitler's character is not irrelevant. And living through today, and he also Fromm theorized narcissism, the politics of narcissism, a whole theory of it, analysis of Himmler, analysis of Stalin, analysis of Hitler, and Donald Trump, Putin, seems to be hard to ignore. Again, not encouraging trying to explain the whole Ukraine crisis through Putin's psychology, of course not. But trying to understand what's happening without a theory, a psychosocial theory of narcissism. Fromm offers something there. Fromm took it past the individuals and argued for a collective sociology of emotions, and we're living in a period where it seems to be hard to ignore the power of emotions. Fromm, part of the why in the Frankfurt School, so he had this money to do this study about it was the study, the F scale, the authoritarian personality that Adorno was famous for. Basically, it was published in 1950, but it was based on a study that Fromm did earlier. And Adorno essentially took Fromm's project. Fromm was kicked out of the project, partly because of money. The Frankfurt School were losing money in their real estate investments, and they had this, this nest egg, and Horkheimer wanted to replace Adorno with Fromm. And Fromm wasn't spending enough time around there. There was personality conflicts, of course, as there always is in intellectual efforts. Fromm was a critic of Orthodox Freudian theory. Adorno and Horkheimer were really enamored with Orthodox Freudian theory. But also, in Fromm's original version of the authoritarian personality, the S scale, working class and Weimar study, he argued that there was such a thing as a left-wing authoritarianism. And this authoritarian personality tradition has been translated largely in terms of emphasizing right-wing authoritarianism. It's hard to ignore right-wing authoritarianism in the world today. So it's certainly not discouraging that kind of research. But can we really look around the world today and say there's not something called left-wing authoritarianism or centrist authoritarianism? It's important to imagine that's got to be the case. And Fromm's theory explicitly addressed that. That was a key part of why he's not known as part of the Frankfurt School. So going back to that. He also offers a theory of that would be useful for environmentalists. And so the book, To Have to Be, he went home, he lived in Mexico for many years, and that's part of his exclusion from networks in the US, and in New York for a while, and in Mexico. But he went home, so he lived in Switzerland, he didn't go back to Germany. His family had, large parts of his family didn't get murdered by the Nazis. He went to Switzerland, and he did a book called To Have to Be, which is essentially an argument for a new kind of social psychology that emphasizes being unhappy with possessions. That book had an enormous influence in Germany on the emergence of the Green Party, the original Green Party. And I would also say that part of the reason why he declined as a public sociologist is that Fromm wanted to talk not just to academic circles, but an elite intellectual circles, New York Times, the New Republic, but he wanted to talk to mass publics. And he wanted to offer the book, The Art of Loving, is a brilliant sort of self-help book. And sociologists are contemptuous of self-help books. But this is a self-help book that it's dated in some ways, sold something like 25 million copies, and it offered a critique of love in a capitalist society. It's very powerful, and had enormous influence, by the way, on bell hooks. Bell hooks very much influenced by Fromm. Bell hooks was also interested in Buddhism. Fromm was also interested in linking Buddhism to sociology. And so, I have a whole other kind of discussion about Jordan Peterson and sort of like how to think sociologically about Jordan Peterson. Because Fromm and Peterson are very similar sociologically. If you take out the politics and the quality of the ideas, if you sort of take out that, maybe some personality factors, if you sort of take out that, in sociological terms, they're very similar. And I think we in sociology have trouble understanding the Peterson phenomena because we're not very good at thinking about the audience that both Fromm and Peterson were addressing to. So that's a challenge for public sociology. How do we reach that audience in a productive way? Now, there is a kind of conventional wisdom that Luke Hoser, who I have a lot of respect for, and was privileged to know a little bit when I was a graduate student in New York, and Lawrence Friedman, was a biographer of Fromm. They both spread what I think is an inaccurate conventional wisdom. There's this view is that Fromm was a great thinker when he was a part of the Frankfurt School, but then in his later life he became a popular writer and he really left scholarship in his later years, and that's sort of explains why he declined. This is really not true. So Fromm wrote a book called Social Character in the Mexican Village with Michael Maccabee, who was a brilliant theorist of personality and researcher, empirical researcher in his own right. And they wrote this really amazing community study that was his most academic empirical research at the end of his life, not in the early. The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness is a book that tries to engage the theories of violence and looks at neurosciences, looks at evolutionary psychology, looks at archaeology, looks at anthropology. And it's sort of like an anti-Pinker sort of book in some ways. Pinker, I think, offers some critiques of Fromm's views. There's a kind of romantic view of the pre-modern societies you get in Fromm, and Pinker, I think, provides some balance to that. But Fromm's politics and his vision, I think, is superior in some sense to have it to be. So I was said later. So it's not really not true that. All right, so where do we go with this? Well, I'm going to kind of make a case for the empirical sociology of public sociology. And the debate, I think, is highly moralistic. So saving sociology, we have to become scientific, save sociology from public sociologists. Or sociology is about changing the world, never mind the science. It seems to me these two choices are polarized and not very helpful. And I think that the case of Fromm is a case where we can explore in one case how to think about that in a different way. And Fromm was very active in politics, at least for a decade. I would use him as a kind of a case study for what I like to say that why intellectuals suck at politics. Intellectuals are not that good at politics. Like the very habitus of an intellectual or academic is kind of in contradiction to what you need to do to be a good politician. Think Michael Ignatieff, say, in the Canadian context. But so Fromm was very involved in the Amnesty International. So his cousin was imprisoned in East Germany. He was the second prisoner of conscience for Amnesty International. Fromm gave a fortune out of his money that he made from these books to Amnesty International. Very involved in human rights. Very involved in anti-nuclear work, anti-war activism. He was an activist in the American Socialist Party. He worked in the Democratic Party. He tried to elect partly to end the Vietnam War, Richard Nixon. And so he spent a lot of time doing activism, but he wasn't really all that good. And he made some contributions, no doubt about it. But I think he as intellectuals, have trouble understanding how politics actually work on the ground. And Fromm had a tendency to be a little bit preachy. And I don't think that is unheard of among academics on Twitter, say, or among sociologists. So there is, I think, a double-edged sword of public engagement. So, and I don't want to make the case here that being involved in politics is a mistake and academics won't learn anything. If I think of Frances Fox Pittman, the great American sociologist, her sociology and her political science was better because of her activism in the world. So you can learn from activism in the world. They change and become a better intellectual and a scholar. But there are other times, and this is true with Fromm, because many people write about Marxism and sort of Marxist theory. But Fromm understood Stalinism not because he read the books, but because his cousin was involved, was arrested by these German Stalinists, and was involved in movements trying to help Polish and Yugoslavian intellectuals escape the clutches of Stalinism. So he was never naive about Stalinism because of what he did in the world, because of his reading of the 1844 manuscripts and something like that. And I think that Fromm's distance from the sociological establishment helped him think about emotions and narcissism and the irrational in a way that sociologists didn't want to talk about that. So it was marginality that helped him think about that. And he took neurosciences and evolutionary psychology and Buddhism far more seriously than sociologists did. And he could actually write, that Irving Howe, the great American sociologist, he helped learn how to write when I was young. And he said, Neil, stop trying to impress all your sociology professors. I was a grad student at the time, just make an argument, and there's something that we can all learn from Erich Fromm and intellectuals of that nature. At the same time, his work became increasingly self-referential as he got more famous. He didn't really keep up with the literature on some things, and the anatomy of human structure is guilty of that. He would have better benefited from engaging with the profession. So there's budding public sociologists out there in the department here or around in sociology in Canada and around the world. Don't just sort of, if you want to be a sociologist, keep engaging with the profession. But in any case, the lessons there's some limits. I think there's lessons, but we're talking about the paperback world. Now we have to talk about social media. So I want to kind of just end on thinking about what we can think about in terms of a research agenda to look at what does it look like to do public sociology in the world of social media. We have to go beyond nostalgia for public intellectuals of the 1950s, nostalgia for scientific sociology. Those ships have sailed. We need to avoid a kind of moralism that I do think we see in public sociology. And we're very skeptical of self-help books. But Jordan Peterson is reaching a mass audience. He's inspiring people, he's bringing people into movements, happen to be the movement, not the movements that I support. And politically, I think we need to, stepping out of my sociology hat here and putting on my political hat. But politically, he's part of movements that we need to defeat. But if we ignore this whole way of talking about people's lives and directly talking to people and insist on talking in sociological jargon, I think we're going to have some problems. And let's be fair, like a lot of the work that we do on public sociology is essentially a version of professional self-help. A lot of the workshops we have, I'm not against the workshops, they're good. Go learn how to use Twitter, it's all fantastic. But I think the problem with self-help books is it tells you how to fit into the society that exists as it is. That's what we're doing with our stuff with public sociology. We're basically saying, here's how to be a better public sociologist. Here's how to get yourself on Twitter. Here's how to get so many followers. Here's how. We have to be thinking a lot more, it seems to me, about what social media is doing to sociology. What's social media doing to universities? What's social media doing to our scholarship? And what's social media doing to politics? I think we have to step back a little bit and not assume that we should all be doing it just because it's a sort of a collective action question. It's not help you, but what does it do for the discipline? So there are, I think, tensions between public sociology and scholarship. We have to look at that and analyze that as a question, as an explicit question. I think that the issue of celebrity intellectuals. So I'm writing about Bell Hooks now, who was very much influenced by Fromm and has a kind of mini celebrity. There's a kind of micro celebrity happening inside the university within certain networks. Peterson has another level of celebrity that was similar to Fromm's celebrity at that time. I think we need a kind of a sociology of celebrities. And maybe Cornell West is another example of a case study. Maybe some of you would have other case studies, and I'd love to talk to some grad students about possible case studies on that agenda. And hopefully we can have a conversation then about the collective consequences of social media for sociology and society. So thank you for the invite.
Usually we let the speaker run the Q&A, but I don't have to run it as well.
Okay. Sure.
Sure. I have questions. So thank you, Neil, so much for coming and for giving this talk. Every time I teach theory, social classical theory, contemporary theory too, I always think of the hundreds of years that we just can't teach because of time. Yeah. So I have a question that's a little related to this, but I think I call it a can of worms question. And this stems a little bit from our Twitter conversations and back and forth emails. I'm curious what you think that the sociology committed to this sort of blended public and scientific endeavor. Like, what should the canon look like? And it's an evaluative normative question, but I'm just curious from your perspective, what would the canon look like? What would a class look like if you were teaching this?
Just in sociology.
Yeah, just in sociology generally. Yeah.
Well, I was very much influenced by Louis Koser, because he was part of the Descendant, which was sort of where I got my kind of politics. And Koser has this book called Masters of Sociological Theory, where I would go in that direction. So you can imagine sort of like going in classical sociology, reading the text, forget about the biography, forget about the context, read the text. Or maybe another approach is a kind of a more scientific approach where you sort of take it out of history, abstract the theory, test the theory, and move forward. That's sort of maybe the two kind of poles. The Koser approach is learn about the biography, learn about the historical context, talk about the ideas, evaluate the influence of the ideas, and then assess whether they're true or not. We sort of like try and do a little bit of all of that. That's the way I would go. And it doesn't always work because it needs kind of giving a lot of students. Each of these approaches have different trade-offs, and has to do with sort of like what sociology majors are, or what what's our place in the university, and what are universities for? It's sort of like linked to that. It's hard to divorce it from that. But I think that's the way it goes. I mean, here's how part of how I could sort of give you like a political issue that I want to put on the table. It's a little bit different from like the classic sociological question around what canons we should engage with and what sociology should look like. But I think that we have a bit of a problem here, is that we're sort of we're teaching theories abstracted from their historical context, in a context where there's deep hostility, and really in the United States, neo-fascist movements. and you know, this whole James Lindsay thing, I don't know if you've been following this, but he wrote this book called Cynical Theory, and he kind of offered a critique. It's part of the Sokol affair, right? Sort of later on. And he had like 20, 30 articles that he sent to journals, and 7 of them were accepted. Like Pope's articles that didn't make any sense, and 7 of them were accepted in social science journals. And then he blew the whistle on that, and now he's sort of gone and kind of, he's actually kind of, personally my think is that's kind of on us. You know, if we have these, people can attack him and it's unethical and all that stuff. But if our journals don't have the quality control, that we can't figure out that that's not a really good article, we have something to fix. You know, that's on us. But he's now gone off into sort of like conspiracy theory. So even after the cynical theory thing, and he has this whole website, and he's sort of like creating these theories about Gramsci and cultural Marxism, and some of that is tinged with anti-Semitism, sort of the whole tradition of the Frankfurt School of anti-Semitism. But we're teaching Gramsci, who was an Italian communist in the 30s, we're sort of teaching him and his ideas without any sense of like the history of who he was and what were some of the tensions between that kind of Leninist politics. We need to do that. And if you want to talk about the Frankfurt School, there's no point in teaching the Frankfurt School. As if we sort of, that's what leads into this, let's find out what Adorno says about today. It's kind of nutty, you know? If you want to find out about like who Adorno was, when he was writing, what issues that they were addressing, what's useful about that theory, and what does the authoritarian personality look like compared to in dialogue with decades of empirical research on social psychology. So I think we have to go in that direction. It's kind of a middle position.
So we need like 5 more masters of social.
Yeah, I mean that's. I mean, you know, you know, this is kind of an institutional problem, right? Because I wouldn't want to turn us into a like this is sort of like a niche thing, you know, sociology of knowledge and kind of stuff. I mean, most of what we have to do is teach students, you know, to think about the world, you know, better, right? And so, you know, it's a kind of balancing act. That makes sense, Dave? Oh, thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was really interesting. I feel like I learned so much about Fromm, so that was fantastic. And one thing I thought was really interesting was when you put up your little charts with the different eras and the little numbers over time,
Yeah.
if that's possible.
Sure.
So when I was looking at that, so I'm thinking about this, when you think about the impact on a discipline, and you have a very reasonable operationalization of that, which is sort of how much it's cited. And I started to wonder, I teach intro sociology. And so I was wondering about if we could think of sort of impact on a discipline in terms of when we teach intro sociology, so when we say like, this is what our discipline is,
Right.
who is included, who isn't included,
Right.
and I'm so surprised to see C. Wright Mills is so low, because I think of C. Wright Mills as like kind of the framework of how we think, you know, the sociological imagination, how we think about things. Now, I can sort of see in some ways that it's sort of hard to cite maybe in one's actual articles, you know, like on various empirical things, for example. But he still seems to be sort of a lens through which we understand sociology. I was wondering if you could just comment on, if instead of thinking about citing people, if instead you were thinking about how we explain the discipline, how those numbers could be different, right? So I think C. Wright Mills would be more important. I think like Du Bois is so interesting because now when we teach intro sociology, I teach about Du Bois, which I didn't, frankly, 5 years ago, right? So, and I teach about public sociology is the end of the class, which I did 10 years ago, let's say. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the last citation, this we get that on the numbers, but
I think someone maybe needs to hit the monitor.
sorry about that. But I can talk about it. So maybe, you know, maybe the issue of heroes is really better than canons for public sociologists. Maybe theory canons, but it's really about kind of heroes, right? So the data that I had was from AJS, ASR, you know, and social forces. So I mean, essentially,
Tell me that, Don.
so in the 50s and 60s, I think Mills was really hated by Merton and Parsons, you know. So he wasn't really, he was cited, it's not nothing, right? So the power elite was cited, the white collar was cited, so he was cited. But nobody cites in the ASR-AJS, the sociological imagination, in this period. It's an attack on Lazarsfeld and Parsons, right? So that his influence partly came from a combination where the steady sites in the mainstream is the power elite, the white collar stuff, and a little bit of the social psychology, because he wrote some stuff about social psychologists and all interactions, and Weber, because he helped translate Weber. So that's where he gets cited in the mainstream. But his real influence is not in at that level. It's as the public face for the discipline, in the intro text, and as you socialize grad students, and as you conceptualize how we present. That's why Margaret Mead said. That's why, and Margaret Mead was increasingly critiqued by academic anthropologists. Some mistakes in her research, and some kind of colonial thinking, and some old-fashioned thinking around gender. And there's a lot of things that critique Margaret Mead. But she was really a public face for anthropology, right? And really helped sort of get funding for anthropology, sort of popularize anthropology. So that's the role that C. Wright Mills plays for sociology. Not as a core theorist or empirical researcher. I mean, the power elite stuff created a kind of a research power elite study. So he gets cited in that. So he helped kind of stimulate an area and kind of translate Weber into sociology. But he's not really like an innovator in the same way that some of these other people were. He's a hero. He offers a vision. He kind of mobilizes people. That's what Fromm did. See, that's what Fromm did. Fromm inspired people into the socialist movement. He inspired people into sociology. He kind of sort of motivated people. That's what he was good at. And Mills was good at that. So that's now Mills also sort of, Mills has a whole story about this. So that's why I think the hero issue is all heroes are partly mythologies, right? And so, C. Wright Mills is seen as kind of this individualistic, speak truth to power, kind of radical. Erwin Lewis Horowitz's book is a radical utopian, American utopian. And he was much more American than Fromm spoken at European cadence. So that was part of why Mills has this appeal on the new Latin. But the truth is, Mills was extremely career-oriented in early years. And if you go through his, some of his letters, he was really wanted to be a big shot. He wanted to move to New York via Columbia to be a big shot. He was really interested in fame. And he worked for Lazarsfeld and Merton. And he took their money to be on this research and never really did what they asked him to do. And so there was a big split around that. And his public sociology was dependent on this administrative research that Lazarsfeld did. Today we call it policy sociology. So the mythology of Mills is actually a social construction. And but it works, it's exciting for people. I'm not against that. But maybe in your intro classes, but later on, there is no Santa Claus really. Here, right? And so the other thing too about that is like Mills. And so I want to say one thing about. I'm going to get political for a second, but Fromm is not a pacifist. So Fromm wrote Escape from Freedom to get America into the war. That's part of why he wrote it. And C. Wright Mills was a pacifist during the Second World War. Fromm would, in my opinion, and it's always dangerous to sort of what would Adorno think about things, but Fromm would stand against Putin and the Russian invasion, and would not take a pacifist position or a neutral position on this conflict. He didn't. But he was an activist in the way that C. Wright Mills was not an activist at all. He was basically an undergrad teacher, and he did research, and he wrote kind of popular textbooks and popular books that didn't reach mass audiences. And he did very little political. Fromm actually did far more political.
Thank you very much.
Can you say more about his intellectual background?
you sort of touch on them, but there must be more to it, because, you know, I'm thinking, you know, what made, you know, Adorno and Horkheimer were actually doing radio shows,
Right.
as was, Walter Benjamin.
Yeah.
There were people who were, you know, in France, you have a whole editorial, Le Monde, crowd that's, that means that everybody in France knows who Bourdieu is.
Right.
And, Fromm must have had more than that than just paperback books.
Right.
To be able to put his name so front and center.
Yeah.
And also, like, it's sort of a sidebar in your talk, but I'm wondering more about the Latin American connection. You know, you can find Fromm's books on Remainder and New in any Mexican bookshop, any Guatemalan bookshop, right?
Brazil.
Which is unbelievable to me. Then you think, I mean, other people don't get that kind of public profile.
Yeah. So I have a chapter. So in the book, the first chapter is the making of a public sociologist and war, sociologist and war, public sociologist and war. So that's but the second chapter is about so the second chapter is about the making of a public sociologist, how he became a public sociologist, not a regular sociologist. And it's about networks. So I have this idea about what I call optimal marginality. So we think about creativity as coming from the center, comes from Harvard or Yale, or you study with Mozart, or you study with the networks of the Western intellectual tradition, on one hand. Or creativity comes from the margins. It comes from the excluded, from the marginalized, racialized. It just comes from women. It comes from the liminal figures. And so I think that sort of we want to think about that in kind of a bit more complicated way. Ask the question: under what conditions does someone on the margin move to the center or become influential in the center? And what are the optimal kind of characteristics or dynamics or networks? This is maybe a network theory, and I did learn from network theory. I never did formal network theory, but I learned from people who are writing in Canada. Thank you for bringing the Canadian network theory to Canada, because it's a very useful set of tools. So what are kind of the network dynamics that created someone who could become so famous and write to the public? And so in this chapter, the making of a public sociologist, basically about the 20s and 30s, essentially what happened was, the way I see it, is that Fromm's kind of politics and his sort of intellectual vision came from Orthodox Jewish thinkers, really radical Orthodox Jewish thinkers. And by the way, he was, but another mythology of Fromm is that he was a conservative thinker. That's the mythology of habits. Marcuse promoted this. But the truth is, Fromm was the most militant and principled pro-Palestinian thinker by far. And it came out of his own Jewishness. It came out of his connection to a set of thinkers that he learned about. So that was sort of the origins of his sort of intellectual vision, kind of Jewish utopianism. So, and he always kept those networks. So that was used. That was very, very important, and he kept them throughout his whole life. Then he did a PhD. So he offered himself to Alfred Weber and became a sociologist. But he never offered his whole soul to sociology. He was always kind of connecting. He always kept this sort of outside the university sort of radical thinkers, right? Jewish thinkers, rooted thinkers, and then he became trained in psychoanalysis. So he developed a whole set of other psychoanalytic contents. And then he became part of the Frankfurt School. So he had these four networks, and these four networks allowed him not to be owned by any one network. In other words, part of the conflict between the Frankfurt School, they had money, and they were trying to bring people into this Frankfurt School network. And Fromm wasn't dependent on that money because he had a clinical practice. He had his own money. So that gave him independence from that network that others didn't have. Marcuse slept on the couch in the office in New York for a while. Eventually, Marcuse worked. We think of Marcuse as the great radical. He worked for the US government, right after the war. Fromm had an independence that the others didn't. And so it sort of played itself. Now, it also sort of unraveled. That's sort of what the creation of his fame came, but it sort of unravels in a way because you get caught in doing too many things just in terms of time. And also, sociologists said he wasn't really a sociologist, he was a psychoanalyst. The psychoanalyst said he wasn't really a psychoanalyst, he was a sociologist, so he kind of got caught in that. So that was sort of the origins. Then there's a fifth network that is involved in the United States. And so he was involved with the Culture and Personality School, and very close to Margaret Mead. So he sort of learned from writers who were writing to the public, Margaret Mead wrote to the public, and they were involved in European foreign policy kind of issues and supporting the war effort. But Fromm didn't really, because of this radical origins, Trotsky, Luxembourg, and his kind of radical duties, he never really was willing to sort of become connected to sort of the U.S. government. He did more than you would think because of Wiesmann. There was a study, Charles Kadushin was one of my teachers, a network theorist. He was on my dissertation committee, and we were called the American Intellectual Elite. And he did a survey and he asked American policymakers, politicians, what intellectual do you listen to? And the top, that's around 1970, this was published, so it's like late 60s data. And they said that the intellectual they listened to most was David Wiesmann. So David Wiesmann was very much part of the establishment. Fromm was very close to it, but he wasn't really totally absorbed by it. So then, so that final network in the U.S. was combining psychoanalysis, anthropology, and kind of like global thinking, and that kind of connected them to the academy, sort of which became less isolated. So that's the kind of the network story of how I think this vein happened. And he was in New York, right? So yeah, he was sort of publishing. The Mexico story is a whole other kind of story. It's part of the story of his decline in sociology because he took himself out of the networks. I mean, part of the reason why he took himself out of his networks is his second wife was very ill, and so living in Mexico for a bunch of reasons was very important for him. I think he was a bit of a kind of he liked rural pre-modern culture, anti-capitalist, anti-market culture. So Mexico, there's also the Freudians were like really attacking him. I mean, the Freudians really hated because there's only one thing that's worse than a sort of anti-Freudian for a Freudian. It's a Freudian who's critical of the Oedipal complex or some patriarchal thinking and sexist thinking within this tradition. That was like, and he wrote into popular magazines, and he wrote in Saturday Review. So it's not just a critique of Freudian theory in the psychoanalytic journals, but it's in Saturday Review, a magazine that might be in the waiting room for your client who's waiting to get your therapy, right? So the Orthodox Freudians they really hated him. So going to, and there was battles, he got kicked out of institutes, things like that. He had an active role in institutes, Freudian institutes, and there are people who know more about that. Michael McAfee knows a lot more about this than I do, but that's, so the Mexico thing was to establish a psychoanalytic institute and sort of non-Freudian, non-Orthodox Freudian, and to sort of, and he had some attraction to Mexico. And the Social Character of Mexicability book is really basically a policy book to figure out how can you develop a society that doesn't have to go through vicious capitalism. It was kind of like, it had that orientation. And Ivan Illich, who's a whole kind of, he was very close. Ivan Illich gave the eulogy for Fromm's funeral. So his networks were sort of like unorthodox, non-academic intellectuals who were critical of the dairy, and sort of getting lots of networks, and Marxist humanists, Yugoslavian Marxists, and all that.
Thank you. So, can I ask two questions?
Sure.
So, one is, like I'm not a theory professor, right? But you're advocating, well, everyone should add Fromm, right? But kind of a sense that, well, then who should be taken out? If you're gonna, because there isn't room to add more and more, like everyone can, so who should we do less of then? And then from today, like, let's say the theory world today, who do you see as the, like, the overrated versus the, people that are saying something kind of new and original? Like, I know you see Peterson probably is overrated, but like, is Zizek saying something original, or is he also over, like, it's kind of, who should we actually be paying attention to?
So the book that I've written and the way that I think isn't really a sort of like bring Fromm to the center of sociology and get rid of these people, right, and replace it, because I'm okay with optimal marginality. You know, the Fromm really, it's not a violin story of like poor Fromm, bringing Fromm in. And the truth is, Fromm is not comfortable with sociology, and we're not comfortable with him. You know? And so, if you think of, I'm very influenced by Alvin Goldner, who's another person who, very influential in public sociology. And so, Alvin Goldner has a terrific book called Two Marxisms. He talks about Marxism's nightmare. So, Marxism's nightmare is that maybe private property isn't the source of all problems. Maybe the working class is not the universal class. And so that nightmare keeps Marxists, up at night. and you try and get rid of it, but it keeps coming up in your sleep because it's not a problem, right? Just like Freudians would say, Freudian's nightmare. Maybe it's not about what the last 40 years. Maybe another way to put it, maybe you can't heal patients and heal pain without changing society. Maybe that's their nightmare. Sociology has a nightmare too. And sociology's nightmare is that it's all social structure. You know, that these sort of psychological things and these existential issues are, the whole kind of the famous joke about sociology, right? How many sociologists does it take to screw in a light bulb? None, because it's not society. It's not the light bulb, it's society, it's social structures that need changing. Well, you know what? It's sort of like changing the light bulb makes sense. That's what Peterson's saying. Clean your room, right? Don't worry about society. Well, that's ridiculous. But cleaning your room, taking care of your own psychic pain, help being good with the people that are around you, and changing society. It's both important. Understanding structurally, changing, and fixing your own home, getting your own home in order. I don't think one discipline can do all that. So, I'm not sure, I'm not really advocating we should all read Fromm and get rid of this person. I think we're okay, as we are. But Fromm offers us something that we should keep as part of our toolkit, and we should consult that will make us more honest and sort of force us to deal with our own nightmares, our own interests. So that's how I would put it. I mean, so I've written with Michael McLaughlin some work about Bourdieu. And personally, of course, Bourdieu is an important thing. Of course, Bourdieu is something that we should continue to engage with and learn from and do research. But the notion of habitus is actually very similar to the notion of the social character that Fromm and so it's in the social character of Mexican village, McLaughlin, a piece of this in a book by Karen Durkin. It's an edited collection on Fromm's critical theory. And what's missing in Bourdieu, and that's the problem with theories, right? Bourdieu's theory had a nightmare too. And that you can sort of, you can look at the social structural habitus without psychoanalytic perspectives. You can sort of understand. I mean, even Bourdieu's little sketches of the autobiography, he says something. The most important thing to know about a person is their field position. It's still ridiculous. That's not the most important thing to know about something. It's a very important thing to know about something. But it's not enough. And so I would say that, so that's what I would think about it. It's not replacing Bourdieu with Fromm. Absolutely not. Bourdieu is a greater sociologist. It's a research agenda, empirical methods. Fromm didn't develop that. It was part of the pre-history of that. But if you read Fromm, you'll notice stuff that's missing in Bourdieu. It won't follow into kind of sociological orthodoxy. less effective in dialogue, and another, the other thing, the anatomy of the human destructiveness book, he basically says, it's an attack on social biology, but it's an attack on popular books about social biology. But he says that we need to read neurosciences. We need to read what later would become evolutionary psychology. We need to, and Mauricio Cantina has a great article. So Mexican psychoanalyst who lives in Washington has a great article called The Greatness and Limitations. Fromm wrote a book called The Greatness and Limitations of Freud's thought. So Mauricio's article is The Greatness and Limitations of Fromm's thought. And Fromm didn't take an adequate account of new research in evolutionary psychology, new research in neurosciences. So Fromm kind of at least points us in the direction of avoiding the things that we don't want to look at. That sort of and there's a sociological reason we don't want to look at it, because it's not part of our habitus, it's not part of our canon, it's not part of our tradition. So do the tradition, but be aware of its problems. It's sort of I don't know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that you got me really thinking about is the resonance between sociology and sort of public ideas, and the way that public ideas can gain currency in kind of like a collective attention space.
Right.
And like, if we think about the sociological imagination, really what it's saying is that individual outcomes are the result of social forces,
right,
not individual choices,
yeah,
right? But that's not the way that the public thinks about the world. Like, psychology and economics are so successful because they tell us that collective outcomes are the result of individual choices. And Jordan Peterson is writing to that audience, right? And so I wonder if it's possible for a sociologist who is saying that individual outcomes are the result of collective social forces to ever gain currency in our current attention space, when that idea doesn't even, it's not even complete in our own discipline, right? It's so fundamental, but it's not complete here. So has the ship sailed on the possibility of sociological ideas becoming collective ideas?
But only if we face our nightmare, right? I mean, it's social decisions are partly based on individual choices. Of course they are.
Sure.
And so we have to confront that directly, especially when we go to the public. I mean, that has to be, and there's a whole bunch of political problems with that. Blaming the victim and all that stuff, and especially with Twitter, right? And so that's part of the problem. That's why I think part of why Twitter is so bad. Because there's some really tough questions that we have to talk about that are impossible to talk about on Twitter. So we have to confront that. If you want to, and again, I would think we want to study this Peterson phenomenon. I have a sort of sociological analysis of the Peterson phenomenon, which basically saying he has 6 roles. He's basically an academic scholar. He's a political provocateur of the right. He's a spiritual leader thinking about religion. He's offering therapy. He's offering himself as a father figure, and he's kind of an entrepreneur that's kind of changing sort of how we deal with knowledge. He's doing these 6 things. So if you want to know what people think of Jordan Peterson, ask them which Jordan Peterson are you talking about, and interact. I mean, his fame came from the interaction of these 6 roles, and his decline or crisis is connected to that. So especially if we go into public, I think that we have to dress not where he's wrong. So Jacobin is a terrific lefty magazine had an article called "Why Jordan Peterson is Wrong About Everything." That's wrong. Nobody's wrong about everything, especially not somebody who's having such influence. He's right about some things. So let's focus on what he's right about and see if we can grapple with that, and then try and engage that in a more sociological way than he less reactionary way, and a less careless way, an irresponsible way. That's the way forward. It's dealing directly with the things that our discipline tells us that we don't want to deal with. Fromm is an anchor for that. It's not the alternative. It's just an anchor for grounding.
Well, I was going to ask a similar question, asking you to talk a bit more about the sort of parallel between Peterson and Fromm. But I guess I was wondering if you have anything to add beyond what you just said about you know, why do you think they're kind of parallel figures, and then other than the obvious political stuff, how are they
Well,
different?
they're parallel because their knowledge base came originally from clinical work. They were therapists. So both of them were therapists. Fromm did it longer, and he was a more original therapist. But a lot of Peterson, some of the insights that he has come from his clinical work, and some of his critique came from things that were happening to his patients and clients. So there's obviously, clinical work has lots of methodological problems and data as a form of data, right? It's not social science in any kind of way, but it tells you something about the world, and they shared that, both in terms of where the data came from and how they think about things and how they write about it, right? Because you're sort of speaking to people's pain in a way, and talking about the world as a kind of therapist. Actually, there's a funny thing where you see, that Milo, not just listening to the kind of raving disorder, and he's gone through this whole kind of thing, and originally, and then Peterson's very irresponsible. He was sort of like promoting, I don't support deplatforming. I don't support that. Dialogue with him in public universities. I don't support that. But he was very irresponsible around the kind of Milo and other stuff. But eventually Milo kind of sort of kind of crazy things, and he came back and did a podcast with Peterson, and he was trying to use Peterson to sort of bring his reputation back and sort of leverage Peterson's now fame. Before it wasn't truly a dialogue, trying to leverage Peterson's fame to sort of help him get back into sort of politics. And Peterson kept switching into a therapy mode. He kept sort of psychoanalyzing Milo and saying, well, why are you, Milo was like, no, this is not, I didn't come on here to talk about this, so there's a therapist thing. So the other issue is this left-wing, right-wing authoritarianism. They're more centrally interested in authoritarianism and totalitarianism, both very deeply interested in those kind of questions. They both were academics who, Fromm made more original contributions in my view. But it's a mistake to say Peterson didn't make any contributions. He had like 4,000 citations or things. I mean, if we disagree with him, just say I disagree with him. Don't try and sort of say he's not really a real scholar. But this is kind of what we're doing. I just think that's unserious. We disagree with him, and let's have that out. But he had some influence. He was a respectable psychologist at the University of Toronto. He was. And so both of them were kind of like social psychological, but not at the center of the disciplines. Peterson was more at the center of the disciplines with grad students, Fromm never had grad students. He taught at Yale for a while, but mostly he taught at liberal arts colleges. And he's sort of a part-time professor. So it's kind of a little bit different. They both wrote self-help books. So The Art of Loving is sort of this major self-help book that had enormous influence, and Beyond Order and 12 Rules for Life are kind of like self-help books. Mm-hmm. And they both sort of like were attacked and critical of the intellectual elite because they were sort of part of it, but kind of not really accepted. It's the same social strata hated both of them, and I would say some of the controversies are kind of similar in terms of how it played out. I would also say that both of them, Fromm was very close to Ivan Illich. Ivan Illich, wrote a very important book called Deschooling Society, which basically said get rid of universities, get rid of schools, right? So like utopian. Like Fromm had that excessive utopianism. So don't follow Fromm for social policy. I'm not arguing that argument, but it's a very powerful critique of schooling and universities. And Peterson has that same kind of critique of universities, and part of it is because both this is what Fromm and Peterson share as a teacher, like they're talking to students. They talk to young people directly, like here's some advice about how to live a good life. That's not how professors talk. That's not how our system is organized. Our universities, like here's what the literature is. Here's my place in the literature. Here's what's going to be on the test. you know? But it's, for me, preaching and telling you how to live a good life, that's a sort of like it's sort of proposing my values, it's sort of my science, there's a whole bunch of things. So their ability or willingness to talk directly to people is partly what gave rise to these. I would say the other thing is that they're both political, but neither of them were really political animals. So Fromm, I have a whole chapter 5 of the book, it's sort of like why Fromm sucked at politics. And he made a lot of contributions, but he didn't really understand how political organizations operate. And I think Peterson's kind of like that. He's involved in stuff. The convoy comes along, gets a convoy person, and is connected to a lot of right wingers. So he's not really a political animal. Fromm wasn't really a political animal. How they're different, you know. Fromm helped create the 1960s. You know, he was you get Fromm's books in Guatemala and Latin America. During the Arab Spring, Escape from Freedom was being sold all over the street. So Fromm is a proponent of freedom and radical intellectual. And so Fromm helped create the 60s. Peterson is part of the backlash of the 60s. Fromm's audiences were sort of like social workers, teachers, kind of new class people, university educated in humanities, and political activists. Right? Peterson's basis is much more engineering students, business students. It's sort of a different social class. This is more like evaluative and political. But my support for politics was the motivation to reject and oppose Peterson's politics. But I think, and the other part of it too, they're also both Freudians. So Fromm is anti-Jungian. There's a whole discussion about Jung. It's very central. So Fromm broke with Freud, but was critical of Jung. And Peterson is a Jungian. But I think Fromm is a far more original, powerful thinker. It's a big difference.
We have one more question.
Yeah, just quick, thanks so much for this. I enjoyed it. Learning about Fromm was pretty interesting. I thought I'd just one quick comment and then just a couple quick questions. I read this book, it's called The Free World by this guy who wrote this is kind of a fun read. It's essentially just like an intellectual history of public intellectuals, I would say. And anyway, just your case, like there's a chapter on Mills, there's a chapter on Reisman, there's no mention of Fromm in the whole entire book, basically. So it kind of just makes your case a little bit that he's forgotten. But like, if you don't mind me saying, like my question though is like, so there are a lot of forgotten intellectuals and public intellectuals or otherwise. Actually, you mentioned Koser, like Koser's a little bit like that potentially too. But I'm still kind of grappling at like, why do I care about Fromm still? Like, what's my takeaway about why I care about Fromm? Is it because he was forgotten? Is it something about his idea? And like, I kind of want to, anyway, I just want to give you a chance just to kind of make the case to me a little bit quickly, I guess.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is, there's few people who are forgotten in so many areas as Fromm, right? That's, so you can tell me.
Most forgotten.
It's quite, but those are connected, right? Like he didn't focus on one area, right? So it's forgotten in all these different areas. So that sort of like exposes something about these areas, right? It sort of shows the crack in those things. So separate from Fromm, it's about these areas. It's about sociology. It's about critical theory. It's about the relationship between sociology and psychology. It's about the relationship between public intellectuals and kind of middle-brow audiences. So I think there's something kind of unique about Fromm that's more interesting than Fromm himself. That's what I would say. That's I would say the same thing with the Peterson thing. I think we'll learn, I happen to be less sympathetic to Peterson than I am to Fromm, but I think we'll learn a lot about the crisis that we're in right now by trying to figure out why Peterson is so influential. I think he'll tell you something that we're not seeing because a lot of the other people I know, they have no clue. Just like people had no clue about Donald Trump, you know. So there's something, so I would kind of make that case. The particular argument for Fromm, I think that sort of an anti-Stalinist socialist humanism is very important for the modern world right now. And the Frankfurt School tradition is a bankrupt tradition, leads nowhere, but formulated through Fromm's ideas in dialogue with empirical sociology, there's some stuff to happen there. And I think that so there's this piece called Optimal Marginality, I'm gonna kind of tell this story. But the other piece of it is that in psychoanalysis, Fromm is forgotten in psychoanalysis when his ideas triumph. So it's a kind of case of killing the messenger and taking the message. So the orthodox Freudian perspective that he had is essentially, it's still around, but interpersonal psychology, object relations, feminist sociologists and psychologists pioneer this. That's where the action is, at least in my view, and that's kind of important. I guess going back to Zizek, now to get sort of, it's also sort of, Fromm is also really important to avoid big mistakes, So I would think that Althusserian Marxism and a kind of anti-humanist Marxism, and I would say maybe Foucault too, there's things that things happen when you go down that path, that Fromm is a useful leverage to avoid. And I think Zizek is a clown, and the debate between Peterson and Zizek was a clown show, in some ways. I mean, I don't want to put it quite that way. I just said it, so that's what I kind of, that's what I think. That's what I think. But I think we should engage and stuff. But the Lacanian Marxism, of Lacan, is totally incomprehensible. Doesn't lead anywhere, and is part of the bankruptcy of the left. If you think the left is going to win with that, I think that we're in for a bad time. So I think there's a kind of a path not taken that sort of and mistakes to watch for advantage to Fromm, and then hopefully once we kind of deal with those things, Fromm will be forgotten. There's no reason to read Fromm because we'll sort of figure this out on our own, and we can let him go. So it's not really about that in the end.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.